we talk about popes dying, I have found at least 4 where the evidence is conclusive that at least 4 popes have been murdered over the last few hundred years. Reason being that these different popes opted to challenge the authority of the Jesuit order. And so we're going to look at those 4 in our talk this afternoon. The first one was Pope Clement XIII. Pope Clement XIII was the Pope in the 1760s. He may have started a little bit before. I don't know the exact dates, but it was in that time frame, the 1760s. And let us remember, as we talk about Pope Clement XIII and Pope Clement XIV, who was also murdered, they were popes on the eve of the American Revolution. It's very significant in light of American liberty. I want to start by reading in a book by Avro Manhattan. He was a British journalist from the British Broadcasting Company. He wrote the book Murder in the Vatican by Avro Manhattan. And this is what he had to say about Pope Clement XIII. This is a little bit of background. It says, the conflict reached a climax during the 17th and 18th century, when the various monarchs of Europe complained to the popes that the Jesuits were preaching revolution, sponsoring unrest and nurturing elements dedicated to the overthrow of the monarchical establishment. The Jesuits had become a kind of recent monarchy themselves, operating inside the ruling monarchs of Europe. Every Catholic monarch of Europe had a Jesuit advisor. No lady with social influence was without a Jesuit confessor. That meant counselor not only in spiritual matters but in social and court problems. Thanks to that, the Jesuits, they managed to influence via their husbands, fathers, or relations highly delicate situations or even political matters. The Jesuits eventually came to have a finger in every political pie in Europe. Now, what is Avro Manhattan saying? He's saying simply this. In the 16 and 1700s, the Reformation has gone off. It's starting to teeter. And the Jesuits, again, retook control of Europe in the 16 and 1700s. The Jesuits advised all the Catholic monarchs. The Catholic monarchs went to the Jesuits and confessed their sins. Any woman of social influence who had wealth would go to a Jesuit, would confess her sins, and the Jesuits knew every secret of homes, churches, and governments throughout Europe. Now, there was something else the Jesuits did in the 16 and 1700s. They had gone across the ocean in exploration, and they found the Guarani Indians of Paraguay. And what the Jesuits did was they created communes. Just like the hippie communes where people would all come together, you remember in the 60s? And everything they would hold in common. You remember that? Well, what the Jesuits did in Paraguay in the 1600s and into the early 1700s, they had these Indians in these communes. And at the head of each commune was a Jesuit advisor. And these Indians would make clocks and rugs and tallow and candles and all kinds of things, herbs and spices. And what would then happen with all of that? They would give it all to the Jesuit advisor. The Jesuit advisor would then give them a little bit of money. All those goods would then be taken to Jesuit-owned ships. All that stuff would be taken to Europe and sold on the European market. And guess who made millions and millions of dollars? The Jesuit order. The Guarani Indians of Paraguay remained dirt poor, just like many South American and Central American nations are today. Finally, what happened, according to Avro Manhattan and the book Vatican Assassins, what happened is the European monarchs that were all Catholics, they started to get very upset. They said, wait a minute. The Jesuits are becoming multimillionaires, and we're not getting our piece of the pie. And besides all that, the Jesuits are infiltrating into our governments, and they're trying to overthrow our kingdoms. And so, many monarchs of Europe began to suppress and drive the Jesuits out of their countries. Now let me read a few of the nations that did that. I'm quoting from Vatican Assassins, but it's from Richard Thompson's book, The Footprints of the Jesuits. And he says the first European power that suppressed the Jesuits and drove them out of the country was Portugal. And Portugal did that in 1759. And I quote these words. It says, in order to protect my royal honor, this is what King Joseph I of Portugal said. In order to protect my royal honor, which is equally the life and soul of the whole monarchy, in order to maintain uninjured my dependence as sovereign and ruler, in order to remove from the midst of my dominions such extraordinary and great vexation, and to shield my subjects from similar frightful occurrences, I declare the so-called ecclesiastics, the Jesuits namely, to be thoroughly corrupt. I declare them to be notorious rebels, traitors, enemies, and disturbers of the peace, and therefore order that each and every one of them may be looked upon as rebels and traitors and treated as such. On the strength of this, I declare them to be denaturalized, exiled, outlawed, and banished, and decree that they shall be expelled from all my kingdoms and lordships, without ever again at any time being allowed to return. So in 1759, 17 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, a Catholic monarch from Portugal banned the Jesuit order from their country. He was the first one. The next one to do it was France. And Louis XV, the Emperor of France, expelled the Jesuits from their nation in 1762. And I'm going to quote now from a book by Theodore Greisinger called The Jesuits, Their Complete History, page 592, in which he says this: whereon the investigation into the constitution and statutes of the Society of the Jesuits resulted in the enactment of a parliamentary decree which shows the odium then attached to the society in France. It denounced their doctrines and practices as perverse, destructive of every principle of religion, as injurious to morality, pernicious to civil society, seditious, dangerous to rights of the persons of sovereigns, that the institutions of the Jesuits should forever cease to exist throughout the whole extent of the kingdom. So here we have the second Catholic emperor, now in France, expelling the Jesuits from their dominion, 1762. The third one was Spain. Charles III, the King of Spain, in 1767, expelled the Jesuits from his dominion. And this is taken also from Greisinger's book. It says his greatest work, the expulsion of the Jesuits, would never have been carried out if he had not been persuaded of its political necessity. The order had already been driven out by Pombal from Portugal, when Charles III was convinced that a riot in Madrid had been promoted by the Jesuits. So the Jesuits were trying to destroy the sovereignty of King Charles of Spain. And so Charles, in turn, drove them out of Spain and all their dominions. And so we see, so far, Portugal, France, and Spain, all Catholic countries, all driving the Jesuits out of their dominions. Now, Portugal, France, and Spain, you remember, in the 1700s, they had tremendous colonies around the world. And so when the Jesuits were expelled from France and Portugal and Spain, they were also expelled from all their dominions. So that meant that the Jesuits were driven out of at least 50 and more countries in the 1700s. Finally, 1768, from the island of Malta, Fra Manuel Pinto de Fonseca, the Grand Master of the Knights of Malta, drove the Jesuits out of their dominions. And that's found in the Encyclopedia Britannica, volume 15, page 343. It says this: in 1768, the Jesuits, having given much trouble, were expelled and their property confiscated. Now, I want to draw your attention to something. There's two very significant things about all this. All of those Catholic emperors of Europe between 1750 and 1769 have all expelled the Jesuit order, who were the military arm of the Catholic Church. 7 years after the man in Malta had driven the Jesuits out of their dominions, came the American Revolution. Now tell me, what would have happened? What would have happened if the Jesuits, in cahoots with Catholic Portugal, Catholic Spain, Catholic Malta, and Catholic France, along with King George, who was controlled by the Jesuit order, what would have happened to this little group of colonies in America if all of those Catholic countries had come against the American colonies in the American Revolution? What would have happened? What's that?
It wouldn't be existing.
That's right. Protestant America would have never existed. Never existed. And so you can see the mighty hand of God moving on these Catholic emperors of Europe and say, drive these evil, treacherous Jesuits out of these countries. Because, folk, if they had not, all of those Catholic emperors, under the influence of the Jesuits, would have united and crushed the colonies. There would have been no Trenton and Princeton. There would have been no Valley Forge. There would have been no Saratoga. There would have never been a Yorktown. There would have been no Constitution. There would never have been Protestant America. But the God of heaven saw. He saw that He was going to cradle a nation in Protestant principles. And so the God of heaven moved on these Catholic emperors to see the treachery of the Jesuits and had them expelled. So that when the American Revolution came, the colonies only had to war against England. Ray.
Where did the Jesuits go after they were run out of the country?
Okay, Ray's question, that's a good question. Ray said, where did they go? The Jesuits were housed in two places. They were housed, number one, in Stonyhurst in England. That's one place where they went. And of course, the Jesuit influence in England influenced King George to suppress the colonies and to lead the colonies to rebel against England. That's the first place. The second place was the Jesuits were welcomed with open arms in Russia. That's the other place where they went. So, the hand of God moved so that the American colonies could fight and win successfully against Britain, and so that we would have Protestant America. Yeah, Ray. I like your questions.
Along about the same time, weren't the Orthodox Catholics in Russia against the...
Ray, save that question. That's a big one. It'll take a while to answer. We'll answer that one at the end, okay? Ray's question was about the Orthodox Catholics in Russia, and we'll discuss that at the end of the tape. But Ray's questions are usually, ones that I can answer real quick. But anyway, we'll hasten on now. We'll get that one later. All these Catholic countries drive out the Jesuits. In late 1760s, the Catholic countries began to put pressure on somebody else to expel the Jesuits and to abolish them forever. And the one who was having pressure put upon him was Pope Clement XIII. Pope Clement XIII was the Pope at that time. And so Pope Clement XIII in 1769 planned to abolish the Jesuit order forever. I want to read a statement to you. Quoting from the book Vatican Assassins, quoting from Richard Thompson's book, The Footprints of the Jesuits. This is what happened to Pope Clement XIII the night before he was going to make a speech to suppress the Jesuit order forever. This is what happened to him. Taken from Richard Thompson's book, Footprints of the Jesuits, page 222. During the night preceding the day appointed for the public ceremony of announcing the abolition of the Jesuits, Clement XIII was suddenly seized with convulsions and died. leaving the act unperformed and the Jesuits victorious. Corminin, a historian, records this event in the terse and expressive words, "The Jesuits had poisoned him." Now, in another book, same one I was reading to you from before, Murder in the Vatican by Averell Manhattan, page 74, it says this. It says, "The Catholic monarchies of Europe insisted that the Jesuits be disbanded and threatened the Pope. Clement XIII, after endless indecision, postponements, and unconvincing delays, finally decided to do what he had been advised he should do. He made ready a proclamation announcing the suppression of the Jesuit order. It was said that the document was written and was waiting for the day when it was to be made public. To the surprise of all, the Pope was suddenly attacked by a mysterious illness. He died on the 12th of February, 1769, with agonizing, unexplained convulsions. Rumors had it that he had been poisoned. The suddenness of his affliction and the convulsions both pointed to it. The suspicions were never proved. It was suggested by those in the know that the Pope had been made to die before he could publish the announcement of the official suppression of the Jesuit order. The actual document itself vanished and was never seen again." Now, some folk would look at that and say, "Oh, but there's no evidence. Nobody has conclusive proof that he was poisoned." No, we don't. No, we don't. But folk, the Jesuits are being suppressed by all the monarchies of Europe, and now the Pope is going to issue a bull that would destroy the Jesuits forever. And the night before he issues it, he suddenly, unexplainably, dies. That was in 1769. Now, the next pope that came into office was Pope Clement XIV. And Pope Clement XIV issued a document in 1773 called Dominus ac Redemptor, abolishing the Jesuit order altogether. He cited the Jesuits for opposition to other religious orders, for revolts and intestine troubles in some of the Catholic states, and persecutions against the church in Europe and Asia. There remained no other remedy to so great evils, and this step was necessary in order to prevent the Christians from rising one against the other and from massacring each other in the very bosom of our common mother, the Holy Church. And it says, after a mature deliberation, we do out of our certain knowledge and the fullness of our apostolic power suppress and abolish the said company. That is taken from Emmett McLaughlin's book called An Inquiry into the Assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So Pope Clement XIV in 1773 abolished forever the Jesuit order. What happened to Pope Clement XIV? Let me read about it to you in this book on pages 74 and 75. It says in 1773 July, Pope Clement XIV wrote an order dissolving the Society of Jesus. This bull, Dominus ac Redemptor, was published the 16th of August of that year. After issuing it, however, the Pope relented in fear of the consequences and tried to withdraw it. It was too late. The papal brief annihilated the Jesuit order throughout the world, closed its schools, canceled its statutes. Its houses were occupied, its general and other dignitaries were imprisoned. As soon as Clement had signed the brief, he predicted his own end. "I am lost," he was heard to whisper. Afterwards, upon hearing the bells of Rome ring, he made another ominous comment. "They're not ringing for the saints, but for the dead." He fell immediately into a singular state of agonizing prostration, sunk under the weight of grief. On October 2nd, 1774, that would be how many months? July, August, September, October. 15 months later, he died with great unexplained suffering. His body decomposed so quickly that it was impossible to show his face. His funeral had to be hastened. The Jesuits were universally accused of having had him poisoned. But once more, no proof was brought to the fore to substantiate such accusations. Now, how did they do it? This is really something. It says this, and this is from Footprints of the Jesuits by Richard Thompson. It says, a peasant woman was persuaded by means of a disguise to procure entrance into the Vatican and offer to the Pope a fig in which poison was concealed. Clement XIV was exceedingly fond of this fruit and ate it without hesitation. The same day, the first symptoms of severe illness were observed, and to these rapidly succeeded violent inflammation of the bowels. He soon became convinced that he was poisoned and remarked, "I knew they would poison me, but I did not expect to die in so slow and cruel a manner." This next part is taken from Theodore Greisinger's book, Complete History of the Jesuits, page 644 and 645. I'll read parts of it. It says, on the day following his death, the process of embalming the body was commenced. The face then presented a leaden color, while the lips and nails had become black. Ash-colored stripes showed themselves too under the skin on the arms, sides, thighs, and feet. The body was opened in order to remove the intestines, which was effected with considerable difficulty, while the whole presented the appearance as if eaten up with something resembling cancer. Not an hour had elapsed before the vessel burst with a loud explosion, and the gases issuing from his intestines produced so frightful a smell that it was impossible any longer to remain in the chamber, and the embalming process had to be discontinued for that day. The question was, who had poisoned him? The people of Rome quickly gave an answer and exclaimed as from one throat, "This the Jesuits have done." The Order of Jesus had perpetrated an act of revenge, and that it was not contrary to their morals that such an act might be accomplished by poison or dagger. Yeah, the fig was given to him about 15 months after he had written the bull to suppress the Jesuit order forever. It's very interesting now, in light of the time, don't forget the time that we're looking at here. Number one, Protestant America is rising up. Number two, it was in this same time period, the Jesuits are suppressed throughout the world. And so what happens? The Illuminati is created. And what was the Illuminati? The Illuminati was a front organization that the Jesuit order hid behind. And so they used Adam Weishaupt to create the Illuminati. They said that he was an ex-Jesuit. That is false. He was a Jesuit. He was teaching canon law, which originated at the Council of Trent in 1545 at a Jesuit university in Bavaria, Germany. So the Illuminati was created 3 years after Pope Clement XIV issued his bull. And the Illuminati has been used as the Jesuits' front organization behind which they would hide. That's the Illuminati. Now, let's take a look at something else real quick, and then we're going to look at 2 more popes before we close today. Why was Pope Clement XIII poisoned to death? Why was Pope Clement XIV poisoned to death? Why? Because they sought to suppress the Jesuit order, right? The Jesuit order calls this payback. Payback. From 1774, when Pope Clement XIV was killed, up until the year of 1800, every single Catholic monarchy in Europe that had sought and had driven the Jesuits out of their dominions, they were all struck down. Spain was invaded by Napoleon. Napoleon was a Jesuit agent trained on the island of Corsica. Spain was invaded by the Jesuits, of which Napoleon was their agent. France lost thousands of their best soldiers because Napoleon let them die in Russia when he deserted them in the Franco-Russian War. Portugal was invaded by Napoleon. Malta was sacked by Napoleon. And you know who else was sacked by Napoleon? And I'll give you a hint. He was sacked in 1798 by a general by the name of Berthier, a pope. Pope Pius the Seventh, I believe. In 1798, he was taken into captivity. The papacy received their deadly wound. Why? Why did a Catholic emperor by the name of Napoleon, why did he attack a Catholic pope? Why? Because Napoleon was working for the Jesuit order to pay back those who had suppressed them. That's why in 1798 the papacy received their deadly wound. It was Jesuit payback. Now let's take a look at the 3rd pope that died at the hands of the Jesuit order. His name was Pope Pius the 11th. Pope Pius the 11th is famous as far as we're concerned because in 1929 he signed a concordat with Mussolini. And in that concordat, the papacy, the Vatican, became an independent sovereign state. Okay? Pope Pius XI was also the man who was instrumental in 1933 in influencing the German Catholic Zentrum to give powers to a man by the name of Adolf Hitler. So Pope Pius XI, a very important pope as far as Bible prophecy is concerned. Pope Pius XI, however, as war began in Europe, Pope Pius XI began to have a change of heart. I want to read a little bit to you from Murder in the Vatican by Avro Manhattan, page 80. He says this: as Nazi Germany was rapidly heading for war, Pius XI prepared to issue a public statement officially condemning Nazi aggression. What happened? Pope Pius XI realized that Hitler was not what he had been made out to be. And Pius XI realized that Mussolini was not the man of providence that he had thought. And so Pope Pius XI said, I am going to issue a statement to all European Catholics to oppose Hitler and Mussolini. Well, you know what would happen to Hitler and Mussolini if all the Catholics of Europe resisted them? They would be toppled overnight. The move would have had a tremendous political impact, since millions of Catholics, many of whom until then had supported the right-wing regimes because of their church's approval, would have hesitated to assist Hitler. Pope Pius XI prepared a special testament or document in which he denounced both Hitler and Mussolini and their preparations for war. Having done that, he convoked all the bishops of Italy to Rome. The statement was going to be read by the Pope himself on the 12th of February, 1939. Guess what day he died? What? He died February the 11th, 1939. Pope Pius XI, however, had become very ill. 48 hours before the day he was to make his pronouncement, he was on the brink of death. He begged his doctors to do all in their power to keep him alive until the 12th of February. I want to warn Catholics everywhere not to support Hitler and Mussolini, he kept repeating. It might help to stop the outbreak of the war. Let me live another 48 hours. The doctors did their best, or did they? Ugly rumors that fascist and Nazi intelligence had a hand in the timely death of the pontiff were never substantiated. The stark fact, however, was that on the morning of the 10th of February 1939, I'm sorry, he died on the 10th. I'm sorry. Only 2 days before he could deliver his anti-Nazi, anti-fascist condemnation, the repentant Pius XI died. Hitler and Mussolini were both Catholic. See, Pius XI was instrumental in bringing Hitler to power and in consolidating the power of Mussolini. But sometimes even popes have a change of heart. And they realize, Pope Pius XI recognized that those two men were bad men. And Pius XI wanted to stop it. And so he was removed. He was removed. It says this on page 89 of Avro Manhattan's book. It says, the condition of Pius XI had been reasonable and fair when between the 8th and 9th of February he suddenly became very ill. In the evening the Pope seemed to have recovered and to be well. Then at 5:30 in the morning the next day, he suddenly died. The most extraordinary thing of all was that an order for an immediate embalming had been given, long before anybody had known of the Pope's death. So what happened was, they didn't embalm his body. Why not? It would suppress evidence. That's exactly right. Very interesting. It's also very interesting, Pope Pius XII, who took over for Pope Pius XI was very much behind Adolf Hitler, very much behind Mussolini. And Pope Pius XII was also the man who created and worked the Vatican rat lines that brought the most notorious Nazi criminals out of Germany down into Italy and sent them on ships across to Argentina in South America. Pope Pius XII was very much involved in that, as well as in the destruction of 1.5 million Orthodox Christians in Yugoslavia. The Serbs, that's right, the Serbs. The last pope we're going to look at, and then we will close for this meeting, is John Paul I. John Paul I was the pope who died in 1978. John Paul I was in office for 33 days. John Paul I, I read a book about him, and I didn't bring it with me. It's called In God's Name, written by a gentleman by the name of David Yallop. David Yallop tells the story about John Paul I. His name was Albino Luciani. And Albino Luciani, as John Paul I, was bringing vast changes to the Vatican. John Paul I was the poor people's pope because he didn't go through all of the rich and all the traditions that normally surrounded the Pope and his coronation. John Paul didn't want to be carried on that chair that they'd carry him through. He wanted to walk with the people. John Paul I was a very different Pope. And he wanted to help people, according to David Yallop's book. In fact, after reading David Yallop's book, you couldn't almost help to even like Albino Luciani. The one thing that continually ran through the book that was so upsetting to me, though, was the fact that Albino Luciani, no matter how right he knew himself to be, and how right what he was saying was, he would always submit it to Pope Paul VI. And that was just... he was Catholic. The crises that John Paul I had to meet once he came into office in 1978, one was the corruption in the Vatican Bank. Paul Marcinkus, a bishop, American-born, was channeling and funneling monies in and out of the Vatican Bank by the billions of dollars, working with the mafia and other underhanded criminals. One was Roberto Calvi. Another one was a man by the name of Sindona. Paul Marcinkus was a crook, and I believe he's still in and controls the Vatican Bank today, and he's still a crook. Another thing that John Paul I was going to have to deal with was a bishop from Chicago by the name of Cardinal Cody. Cardinal Cody was paying a woman thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to keep their relationship quiet. So John Paul I was going to have to deal with Cardinal Cody of Chicago, the most wealthy diocese in the world. The other thing that John Paul I was going to have to deal with was the fact that throughout South and Central America, many Roman Catholic nuns, priests, monks were fighting in civil wars in South and Central America over liberation theology. And that was something that the Jesuit order had created, and it was something that the Jesuit order was promoting in South and Central America. When John Paul I found out about it, he was very upset because many Roman Catholics were dying in South and Central America. And so John Paul I was going to do something about it. And I want to read to you what he was going to do about it. Let me read to you. This is from David Yallop's book. I'll quote it from Vatican Assassins. It's from David Yallop's book, In God's Name, pages 176 and 177. It says, John Paul had said that the following morning he was going to read personally to Father Arrupe, the Jesuit general, a document which he had written himself. Although he did not reveal its nature, it had something to do with liberation theology. The Jesuits behind the whole movement of liberation theology were supporting communist guerrillas. Some of these movements were even led by the Jesuit padres. Father Arrupe, their general, who had been in contact with Moscow, had become a ruling pope himself with a private army of his own. Pope John Paul became perturbed about the whole problem. The new pope decided to start dealing with Father Arrupe, perhaps with Father Arrupe's dismissal. So Albino Luciani was going to get rid of Pedro Arrupe, the Jesuit general. He was going to oust Paul Marcinkus of the Vatican Bank, and he was going to dispose of Cardinal Cody of Chicago. John Paul I was dealing with some heavy hitters, and he paid for it. From Murder in the Vatican, pages 122 to 124, I'll read just some of it. It says, some of these had become embroiled in mysterious manipulations and financial transactions. They included Catholic bankers, Catholic speculators, and their manipulation of vast funds which had included the Vatican Bank. Cardinal Benelli had seen to it that the Pope should become familiar with the files dealing with Bishop Marcinkus. Also with those of previous bankers called Sindonia, and with Roberto Calvi. Calvi, the head of the Catholic bank, Ambrosiani, had been dealing with Marcinkus for years. But Luciani, as the new pope, had the power to see that the files of both Marcinkus and Calvi were seen. The intricate financial operations of the Vatican Bank were even more shocking. John Paul I had the power to bring into the open the Vatican Bank scandal. Let's see here. Pope John Paul I became worried, very worried. His fears were no fantasies, they were realities, enough to give a nightmare to any pope who wished to avoid a repetition on a colossal scale. The crooks in the Vatican, from what he had seen, were ready to strike again, and John Paul decided there and then that it was his duty to do something about it, and quick. And then we read on pages 129 and 130 of the same book. Soon after the conclave, the new pope had a talk with 20 cardinals from Latin America and was deeply impressed by the fact that most of them supported liberation theology. During the previous 5 years, he was told, Jesuitical Catholic cells had multiplied and were still multiplying very rapidly. These communities or cells were called communicades and operated in the gospel spirit. John Paul was shocked. Although he had heard of liberation theology, he had never imagined its reality to have assumed such vast, menacing dimensions. Between 700 and 800 priests and nuns had perished fighting alongside the guerrillas. John Paul became perturbed about the whole problem. It was obvious he had to do something very drastic about it, like neutralizing Father Arupe and his Jesuitical battalions in Rome as well as in South America. The new pope decided to start dealing with Father Arupe, perhaps with Father Arupe's dismissal. But then before that, Pope John Paul had to deal with a no less urgent task. The Vatican Bank, plus its shady financial operators, and last but not least, with the Curia itself. Many heads would soon be made to roll. The quicker, the better. And so whose head rolled? Bishop Marcinkus? No. Cardinal Cody of Chicago? No. Father Arupe, the head of the Jesuit order? No. It was John Paul I. The night before he was going to talk and issue his commands that Bishop Marcinkus should be relieved of his duties at the Vatican Bank. The night before, he was to issue the statement that Cardinal Cody of Chicago would be removed and that Pedro Arupe would be dismissed as Jesuit general. Pope John Paul I mysteriously died. Same symptoms as Pope Clement XIV. Body became blackened very quickly. Body smelled. Eyeballs were shooting out of the sockets. His gums were way back up against his face. He had been in tremendous pain just before he died. John Paul I was poisoned to death. According to Avro Manhattan's book, there are, I think he said, at least 78 different poisonous drugs that are out there on the market today. In fact, I remember watching a videotape with my students several years ago at Rolling Hills Academy. And I don't remember the man's name, but there was a European gentleman who was disclosing things that should not be disclosed. And he was in London, and I believe he was walking across one of the bridges that spanned the Thames River there in England. And as he was going across, he stopped to look out over the bridge onto the Thames River, and a man walked by him and with an umbrella simply poked him in his hamstring, in the back of his leg. And the man, the gentleman that was looking at the water, he went, "Oh, ouch!" And the man with the umbrella said, "Oh, excuse me," and walked on. And a few days later, the man who had been poked, he died. He had been poisoned. Within the tip of the umbrella, they had put a very, very tiny needle. And when the man shot it into the back of his leg, it inserted into his bloodstream poison that was on that needle. And the man died a few days later. It was supposed to have been a KGB job, but if history tells us anything, and we need to remember the KGB, the Mossad, the CIA, the FBI, and any other private organization out there in our world today that is charged with any crime whatsoever, it is because they have learned it from their masters, who have been doing this for the last 500 years, the Jesuit order. That's where it comes from. And that's where they've learned all their tricks of the trade. It's from the Jesuits.